Guys, Miss Cote here, and this is the sixth and last video in the cell and division and reproduction unit. The last video explored how plants make their gametes in order to reproduce sexually. In this episode, we're going to look at the different ways that animals can reproduce. So let's get started. The basis of animal reproduction is simple. Animals need to reproduce in order to maintain the species, or else the species will become extinct. Animal reproduction can take many forms. You guys are probably most familiar with the male parent producing sperm and the female parent producing an egg, and these two gametes will come together during fertilization and form a zygote, which will grow and develop into a new individual. However, please understand that this is not the only method. Did you know that some animals have both male and female reproductive organs? Or that in some species, organisms can change what biological sex they are under certain conditions. Or even that some animals can reproduce without even having sex. And this is what we'll be exploring in Chapter 46. There are two types of reproduction in the animal kingdom, sexual and asexual. Sexual reproduction is the one that you're more familiar with, the sperm and egg coming together to form a zygote. Asexual reproduction, A meaning without, is the creation of offspring without sex, without a sperm and an egg coming together. Let's take a look at various methods of asexual reproduction. Common in simple invertebrates is a method called budding. This is simply where a new individual starts as an outgrowth from the parent and eventually breaks off to become its own organism. This organism shown in the picture is called a hydra, and every new baby hydra will be a clone of the original parent, genetically identical in every way. Another common method for invertebrates is fission. The definition of fission is the splitting or breaking up into parts. You learn the term when learning about how prokaryotes divide, by binary fission. Here we have a sea anemone in the process of splitting itself into two, and again, each new anemone will be genetically identical to the original parent. A third method actually takes place in two parts: fragmentation, breaking of the body into several pieces, and regeneration, or the regrowth of lost body parts. Again, this happens in invertebrates, such as certain worm species, like this planaria here on the left, or probably more well known to you is the sea star, formerly known as the starfish. If one of these organisms is split, the pieces have the ability to regenerate into a whole organism and will be genetically identical. The last form of asexual reproduction I'd like to mention is parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis literally means virgin creation, and this is where an unfertilized egg can develop into a new individual. Again, most organisms who use this form of reproduction are invertebrates, like this bee and other insects. But there have been cases of vertebrates, like the Komodo dragon here, or the hammerhead shark, where females in a zoo and isolated from any males have produced offspring. And because they develop from an egg, these individuals will be haploid, although there are exceptions to the rule. That covers the various forms of asexual reproduction. If you noticed any trends, this type of reproduction predominantly happens in the simpler invertebrate animals. And again, there are always exceptions to the rules. It's probably in your best interest to be able to explain one of these methods along with an example of an animal that can reproduce through that particular method. While some animals reproduce primarily through asexual methods and some reproduce only by sexual methods, there are animals that have the ability to do both. So what are the pros and cons of each type of reproduction? Let's take a look. Remember that the whole point of reproduction is to continue the population of the species, because if reproduction stops, then the species will become extinct, and that would be bad. In asexual reproduction, offspring can be produced with less energy input from the parent, and if we compare asexual females to sexual females, twice as many more females will be produced through asexual reproduction, like this figure on the left. But the downside to this would be that each offspring is genetically identical to the original parent. So if the environment changes to be unsuitable for those individuals, the population will be wiped out fairly quickly. In sexual reproduction, it may cost more energy-wise to produce offspring, but the upside is that the population will become varied in its genetic makeup. And so if the environment changes, the population has a better chance of surviving if there are individuals who are suited to the new environment. For animals that have the ability to do both, it's more advantageous to reproduce asexually when the environment is stable and beneficial. Many offspring will be created in a relatively short amount of time with little energy. And if the environmental conditions change, the organism can switch to sexual reproduction to ensure genetic variability and survival of the species. So I guess it depends on the situation and what the needs of the population are at a given point in time. In the last episode, I discussed that seeds will only germinate under certain environmental cues to ensure the survival of the new plant. Animals are the same. You don't want an animal to invest time and energy into creating offspring only to have those offspring die in harsh conditions. That would be a huge waste. To ensure that baby animals will be born at certain times, let's say early spring when the weather's getting warmer and plants are growing, which provide a food source, animals have reproductive cycles where they are able to reproduce at certain times or seasons. Cycles vary depending on the animal. While humans have a 28-day reproductive cycle that happens all year long, animals such as sheep have 15 to 17-day cycles, and these only happen during fall or early winter, so the baby lambs will be born in early spring. These cycles are controlled by both hormones and environmental cues. Females who are ready to mate usually exhibit mating behaviors, which we will look at in more detail later on in the course. In one weird case of mixing asexual reproduction with reproductive cycles and mating patterns, here's a species of whiptail lizard. While there are other species of whiptail lizards who reproduce sexually and follow a cycle and mating behavior, this particular species is asexual. They're all female, and they reproduce by parthenogenesis. However, in order to trigger ovulation to produce that unfertilized egg that will develop into a new lizard, one female in a pair will mimic male mating behavior. Who acts as the male and who is the ovulating female is going to depend on hormone levels. So while they have evolved asexual reproduction, they still require cues to reproduce. And when you think about sexual reproduction, you usually just think about humans and how humans reproduce, but not all animals act the way humans act. So there are variations from what you think is normal. For example, there are animals who have issues finding a mate, whether these animals are stationary and can't move, like barnacles stuck to a boat, whether they burrow in the ground, like a clam or an earthworm, or whether they're pretty isolated, like a tapeworm. One adaptation that arose through evolution to address those issues is hermaphroditism. Hermaphroditism is when an individual has both working male and female reproductive organs. So any two individuals can mate, and each individual will both donate and receive sperm. In some species, self-fertilization can happen, but remember, this is sexual reproduction since gametes are being made. Just remember that slug video I showed you in class. That's a classic example. Another pattern that you may not be familiar with is sex reversal. Some animals can change sex. Some go from male to female, and some change the opposite way. And it depends on the species of animal. For example, in a species of fish called the bluehead wrasse, the groups are made up of all females and one male. When the male dies, the largest female assumes the role of the male and is able to produce sperm. The opposite happens in the clownfish. Groups are all males and one female. And when the female dies, the largest male will switch sex and become the female of the group. And in oysters, sex depends on size. All oysters start out as males, and when they reach a certain size, they will become female. In sexual reproduction, no matter the pattern of how an animal reproduces, the goal is for the sperm and egg to come together in a process known as fertilization. And there are two different ways fertilization can happen: external and internal. External fertilization is where the sperm and egg come together outside of the organism. This needs to occur in a moist environment, so an aquatic or a very humid terrestrial habitat, because the eggs don't have shells and you don't want them to dry out. Plus, you need a medium for the sperm to be able to swim over to where the eggs are. For example, here we have two frogs. Now, contrary to what you may be thinking, when the male frog is on the female frog's back, they're not having sex. This behavior triggers the female to release her eggs. So the black spots that you see around the frogs are the nuclei inside the clear eggs. So the eggs are outside of the female's body. And the male frog will release sperm to hopefully fertilize the eggs. This is how frogs, fish, and many other animals accomplish sexual reproduction through external fertilization. Internal fertilization is what you're more familiar with. Sperm are deposited either inside or near the female reproductive tract, and the sperm will swim inside the female to find and fertilize the egg. Obviously, both sexes, male and female, need to interact with each other, and their reproductive organs need to be compatible. The last concept I want to touch upon is the idea of parental care. With animals that reproduce using external fertilization, females lay hundreds to thousands of eggs, and males put a layer of sperm over those eggs, and both parents generally swim away, leaving any offspring to fend for themselves. The large number of offspring is to make up for the lack of parental care, and hopefully some of those offspring will survive and develop into adults who will eventually reproduce in the future. In contrast, animals that do internal fertilization have less offspring, but the parental care is there to make sure that those few offspring do survive. Think about birds who lay a few eggs at a time. Those embryos are protected by the outer shells, and they have one or both parents care for those eggs and for the baby birds that hatch until they're ready to go off on their own. In other animals where the offspring develops inside the female and is birthed, the parent cares for their young until they're able to survive on their own. The type and length of parental care varies from species to species. Humans are probably the extreme, since parents are responsible for their children until the age of 18. So that's it for what you need to know from chapter 46. I'm sorry I put this video up so late. It's the Christmas season and I am not home because I'm constantly on the go doing stuff. But don't stay up too late studying for your test tomorrow. And as always, be smart and be safe.